That's going to close some people down, even if they live in lovely houses and earn huge sums of money. And that's all still on the horizon, partly because it was a £45 billion package of tax cuts that has now become a £43 billion package of tax cuts. So what's the least we can do to mollify these backbenchers, Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss have calculated, without actually making much of a difference to the overall package? And I think that's where they've come. Interesting. Thank you, Martin. We'll talk again, I hope. The conversation this morning is I think it's been upside down. I think the second hour has been more illuminating than the first hour, which is my fault. It means I came in from the wrong angle at the very top of the show. But the more we talk about it, the more we consider it, the ramifications, the realities, the economics of it, the more complicated it becomes, not the more simple. It's often the way the more we talk about things, the more sense they begin to make. So the simple bit is this. It's short-term political survival that has prompted this U-turn. Okay? Long term, it's almost certainly made things worse rather than better because, at a micro party level, everyone who's been defending it has been rendered ridiculous. And everybody who despised it for its unfairness and its callousness knows that you are now unfair and callous politicians. So there's no real winner here, except in the very short-term party calculations. But the bigger picture, as I say, is getting uglier and uglier, which is why I'm now wondering what's going to happen next. 11:41 is the time. People queuing up. Admittedly, this programme is a slightly self-selecting sample, but people queuing up to welcome the news that a tax policy designed to further enrich them has now been abandoned. Gurdip is in Wakefield. Gurdip, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for having me on. I've got a couple of points. You started the programme off with the analogy that he's in the casino, the chips are on the table.
Yes. Are you going to be a pedant?
I don't know, but I don't think. I think the chips were on the table, but we lost 65 billion in that gamble. So he hasn't pulled it back in time. He's actually
that's a very good point.
Trying to pull it back.
I'll be the pedant then, because I got this off Lee about an hour ago. I forgot to read it out. Most croupiers won't be out of bed yet, James. But speaking as a former dealer, you can actually move your bets off the table until the dealer calls no more bets, which is usually a couple of seconds before the ball drops. But in fact, you're reminding us the ball did drop, didn't it? And 65 billion pounds later, he's sort of trying to do a U-turn on the original bet.
Yeah, and the annoying thing is we don't get to elect these people, and they'll be cheered on this week by the people that did elect them as if nothing's happened.
But will they? This is the interesting thing. There's a lot of MPs who aren't even there. Who in that room is going to be standing on their feet and cheering when Liz Truss finishes her speech? Is it tomorrow, probably?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. And it's annoying. I personally... I wonder what is they went through the selection process, which lasted about 2-3 months, if it felt like.
Yeah, no,
I mean, and then these are the policies they had, and then they said they didn't lay the groundwork, and the Bank of England didn't even know what they were doing. You've got to question. It's like the thick of it.
It is like the thick. It's worse than the thick of it, actually, because we don't. They're telling fibs as well as doing the spin and the ludi. So we're not going to get the analysis off the OBR because it's not a proper budget, but it contains more sweeping tax cuts than we've seen for 50 years, but it's not a proper budget, so we don't need the OBR. And then, we will consult the OBR, but we won't tell you what they've said until the end of November. Bank of England has come in independently and undone some of the damage that we've done to the pound, but we don't recognise that what we did was responsible for what happened to the pound. Kwarteng this morning claiming it was about the Fed in America, about the Federal Reserve in America. It's as if that Martin Wolf thing in the Financial Times is bang on the money. It's as if they just keep insisting that their version of reality is true, even as the rest of us inhabit the real reality.
The real reality is that the wealth of a British person has halved in the last 15, 20 years compared to a US, Canadian citizen, probably Australians, probably a lot of people around the world. That's the value of our pound has halved in comparison to those. And I would make two proposals. One is that the Conservative Party not be allowed to just elect a new leader all the time, but it has to go to the country. And my second proposal is that economic policy should just not be down to politicians. It's got to be done by the experts. I mean, I can't...
Well, that's, to be fair, that's what the civil service is.
If our wealth is halved...
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. If our wealth is halved, then they ain't been doing a good job, but no one's telling them. No one's telling the public that. that your wealth is halved in comparison to the rest of the world.
Well, I don't know that is. I mean, it's an analysis it's an analysis of the performance of the pound. But in terms of where your money in this country gets you and what it buys you, it's not strictly accurate to put it in those terms. But I take your point, and I'm not qualified to sort of lock horns further or to dig deeper into that. But I do, and there are other economies that have, for example, got much higher inflation than we've got at the moment, which means that their money is going to be going less far than our money currently is. But, I mean, there are times where you think Liz Truss is just saying to companies with worse performing economies than ours, she's just saying, hold my beer. But, no, I take your point. And just in response to the thing about politicians versus experts, the problem is experts don't always agree. I mean, even on Brexit, you could find one or two economists that would say it would be a good idea to argue against the several million that said it would be a disaster. And that's what the civil service is traditionally for. I mean, they are the experts. For example, in the Treasury, who would say to a chancellor, I'm not quite sure about this. Obviously, if you decide to press ahead with it, we will do our very best to make sure that it goes as well as it possibly can. But have you taken into account X, Y, and Z? Which is why, of course, the first thing Kwasi Kwarteng did when he became Chancellor of the Exchequer was to sack the most senior civil servant in the Treasury. 11:49 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. A little more on this. I'm not quite sure what we're going to do next. Hospitals are scrapping more than 22,000 appointments every day, which is very difficult to talk about without mentioning that it looks as though they're going to have even less money to spend as a consequence of Kwasi Kwarteng's budget. Jacob Rees-Mogg's business partner has been appointed a government minister and made a peer. It's just plus ça change, isn't it? You know, meet the new boss. She's the same as the old boss. Girls do not want to work in an office and are more concerned about their health than they are about becoming leaders. I do like, speaking as a feminist, I do like stories that remind us, or at least suggest that there remain big differences between the sexes. We may draw attention to that just to take a bit of a break from politics. I don't think any of us have got the energy for this story about nearly half of young people worrying that they won't be able to afford food this winter, with more than a third planning to leave education or training. There's a teachers' strike on the horizon. And drug use among 16 to 25-year-olds rose by half after COVID rules eased. I presume part of that, you'd need to see what the comparison was to pre-COVID drug use, wouldn't you? Because I presume part of that was because the trade was curtailed by lockdown and COVID, a bit like when Priti Patel was boasting about how there'd been a massive reduction in shoplifting when all the shops were shut. Do you remember that? It's quite funny. Andrew's in Chelsea to steer us back to this story, which has changed shape the more we've talked about it. I'm thinking now the real distraction is the U-turn, actually. It's this 2 billion quid's worth of distraction from the fact that we've still got a £43 billion tax cuts package that is largely unfunded and entirely unexplained. But Andrew, what made you pick up the phone?
Morning, James. I'm a trader of government debt, specifically UK and European bonds. And I can tell you this morning, from a market point of view, interest rates have about 25 basis points less priced,
right,
which means it's not going to go up as much. From a bond yield point of view, it hasn't really changed. And from a pound point of view, it's pretty much unchanged. So what they announced today economically, I mean, it hasn't really moved that much, the markets.
It's the prediction of where we'll be next year on interest rates has come down from 6% to sort of 5.5%, 5 3/4. In layman's terms, that's what you're telling us.
Yeah, exactly. And to be honest with you, 6% was a bit, it was a bit toppy. I don't think
punchy.
Anyone really thought it was going to go 6% interest rates, like in the financial markets anyway. So you could argue that we've just taken a bit of froth off.
Yes.
Now, in terms of credibility, from a financial market point of view, this government has completely lost every ounce of credibility it had by announcing unfunded tax cuts in the first place, and also now backtracking on tax cuts. So they've been hit with a double whammy almost in terms of a lack of credibility. The best thing they could have done today, instead of announcing the abolishment of the tax cut, would have been to announce that the OBR was going to release all the figures next week. I think he gets them next week.
He gets them on Friday. He gets the first draft on Friday.
So Monday morning next week,
Yeah.
they should release immediately.
Now,
And
tell me
from
why
that-
that's important. Remember, a lot of people listening, including this bloke talking to you now, me, don't know as much about this world as you do, and what is bread and butter for you is quite new for the rest of us. Why is that so important to you as a government bond trader, a government? Well, you've told us what you do. To the markets in general.
It all comes down to credibility. When you're relying on the financial markets, as the UK does,
Yes.
and if you go back and listen to our former Bank of England governor, Carney,
Yes.
he really sums it up 100% correctly. We rely on the goodness of strangers to finance our government debt. Completely reliant on foreign creditors. And when you're asking foreign creditors to prop up your debt when there's no plan, there's no figures, there's no meat on the bone, it's just completely unreasonable. And what's staggering...
You can't believe what you're seeing, can you? How long have you been doing the job?
I've been doing it 25 years, and it's absolutely staggering.
Yeah.
I
can hear that in your voice.
It just beggars belief that they would have announced this without any kind of input from the financial market. Anyone could have told you this would have happened. I predicted it was going to happen, and I profited handsomely from it. But anyone in the financial markets could have told you this would have happened.
Well, Danny did as well. Danny Blanchfield.
Your past caller was correct.
Yeah.
They don't listen to experts, and if they'd have listened, maybe they did, because the Chancellor's friends with hedge fund managers. I failed to understand how he didn't ask them what the reaction would have been. And they would have told him, surely, unless they lied, because they were talking their book.
You would think
they wanted the pound to collapse. It really is staggering.
And here we are. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel, actually, from where you're sitting? If they carry on this path, they've cut a £45 billion package of unfunded tax cuts to £43 billion. So that explains why the movements we've seen and that you've described this morning have been at best incremental. If they carry on this path... It's your job to know, isn't it? You bet on what happens next, don't you?
I tell you what would make me buy every government bond in sight is if the Chancellor resigned.
Yeah.
And if they do what they should have done in the first place and say, we're doing the energy package, we are going to freeze the company tax, but in terms of tax cuts, we will look at that in the future once market conditions allow and once inflation subsides. If they'd have done that in the first place, she would have been the darling of the conference.
So chuck the Chancellor out and slam the brakes on the tax cuts
until market conditions allow.
Until market conditions improve. She wouldn't have been the darling of the conference because she got elected on a promise of immediate tax cuts.
Well, yeah,
So that's politics.
Did she really? Yeah, that's another story. Did she really get elected on that?
I don't know. Actually, I don't know what she got elected on, mate. And I do this for a living.
Exactly.
I'm going to keep your number. And one day soon, possibly this week, depending on how busy you are, I'd really like to do a proper talk about what you do.
Yeah,
because
no problem.
all this talk about gilts and government bonds and debts, it is quite hard to follow. And you're very articulate. You've got a great clarity of expression, and I'd like to benefit from that without talking about the news of the day. I'd like to talk about the context, the background of what people like you do and why it is so powerful and important and has ramifications at every level of the economy. Can we do that at some point this week?
It'd be an absolute pleasure. No problem.
Thank you, Andrew. I genuinely look forward to that because I don't think anyone will be surprised to learn it will be as much for my benefit as it will be for the benefit of anybody else listening. But there you go. And again, quite open about the fact that he's obviously made a killing out of what has gone on, but is genuinely befuddled by the fact that it was so easy to do and so obvious to do. 11:56 is the time. Pete's in Bristol. Pete, what would you like to say?
Morning. Just on this things getting better or worse, I just want to say worse because the whole country now realise they haven't even learnt the mistake which got rid of Johnson, which is sending all these MPs out to defend stuff and then them having to be rowed back in within 24 hours.
It was known in the trade. It was known as doing a generic at one point. Honest Bob Generic was the one that was usually sitting in the back of his car on the way back from Sky News when he heard that Boris Johnson had abandoned the policy that he'd just spent the whole morning defending. But it happens so often now, it seems unfair to pin it on one person.
Yeah. And somehow, they literally lost a prime minister over that and they've still not learnt the lesson. So that's the sort of things are going to get worse thing, or people realise are getting worse. But I have to admit, I think it's going to be slightly better because it might put a pin on all these other things. You've just spoken about it with people who are aware and
Yes.
thinking about it. But I think a lot of people that are still busy day to day, they'll be like, oh, well, they went back on it, didn't they? You know,
I don't know. I mean, you never know. It depends how keen you are to see the. I mean, there's not a lot of generosity out there. There's not a lot of warmth, and the idea that you're on the doorstep and somebody says, "I can't believe you were going to give a tax cut to people like, you know, the Lord of the Manor over the road," and the Tory MP says, "Yeah, but we abandoned that," and I don't have to, oh yeah, good one. Actually, you've got my vote. I can't quite see that yet, but you might be right. You might be right.
Yeah, and I'm a bit surprised people are still talking about ideology, if I'm honest, because if we just, you know, look at all the scandals and things that have happened, you know, just talk about Cameron and Greensill, Patterson, right? And even with like Kwasi, all this talk about is he in cohorts? If he in cohorts with shorting them out, the one thing that ties all of these things is money. This is just old school corruption,
money and cronyism.
This is not some like, oh wow, we really think we're going to make a better world or something. If they wanted to make a better world, Johnson wouldn't have gone missing in action for as long as he did. It's just money. It's just old school corruption. That's all it is.
The money. Follow the money. Show me the money. Show me the money. Show me the... And I'll tell you what, imagine if Jacob Rees-Mogg's business partner had just been appointed a government minister and made a peer after giving 300 grand to the Tory party. That really would prove your point. So we can all breathe a sigh of relief that nothing like that would ever happen in this country, can't we?
Yeah, a big sigh of relief that is not happening right now. You know, brilliant.
Well, there you go, Pete. It's coming up to 12 noon. Quite a lot of you are drawing my attention to comments made by Jake Berry yesterday. It's so hard to keep up with all these kind of... I mean, I can't even use the National League North as an analogy now for sort of... Because my own team is riding high in the National League North, and they're brilliant footballers. It's a wonderful team to support. So what can we talk? A pound shop. All these pound shop politicians. I can't keep track of them all. So Chris Philp sort of came out of nowhere. Amazing article in Private Eye about his business background, which I recommend you have a look at if you get the opportunity. If not, I'm sure someone would have tweeted it. And now this bloke, Jake Berry, who has been essentially advising people who are worried about the cost of living. But do you want to know what his advice is? You're going to love it. It's brilliant. Absolutely genius advice. Oh, I'll tell you after this. 3 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Let's talk about Jake Berry, MP for Rossendale and Darwen, chairman, no less, of the Conservative Party. Did you know that Marie Antoinette almost certainly never said that thing about let them eat cake? Or indeed brioche, which kind of your average pedant, including me, used to point out, no, she never said cake, she said brioche, like that sweet bread. Do you know that McDonald's buns are closer to brioche than they are to bread? They've got so much sugar in, or they certainly used to be. I don't know if the recipe has changed. So Marie Antoinette never said. There's a possibility it was said by Marie Therese, who was married to one of the Louis earlier, long before Marie Antoinette's time. But Rousseau had a line in one of his essays about a princess, a well-known princess, who, when told that they were that the peasants were starving and couldn't get any bread, she said, that let them eat cake or let them manger brioche. So never did it. Marie Antoinette, haunted throughout history by that misattribution. I mention that because Jake Berry, the chairman of the Conservative Party, really did say this, and I mean, I've got proof.
People know that when their bills arrive, they can either cut their consumption or they can get higher salary or higher wages, go out there and get that new job.
Sure, it's
That's the
changes.
Approach the government is taking.
You
we
can
are
decide
saying,
to
look,
cut taxes for
let's
the wealthiest or upright benefits
create
for the
growth
poor.
so households can afford their bills, as well as the brilliant work we're doing on energy.
Lovely bloke. So it made me wonder what sort of people he was talking about, because we learnt last week that 1 in 4 hospitals, may have been more than that actually, but they were now opening food banks for their own nurses. So that would suggest that these nurses have probably already cut their cloth and they are still struggling to make ends meet. Jake Berry's advice is that they stop being nurses and go out, presumably, and get jobs as gilt traders. I don't know. I just can't remember hearing a politician so completely out of touch with reality as this bloke is. Have another listen. This is the chairman of the Conservative Party addressing the cost of living crisis that you are currently worried about.
People know that when their bills arrive, they can either cut their consumption or they can get higher salary or higher wages, go out there and get that new job.
Sure, it's
That's the
changes.
Approach the government is taking.
You
we
can
are saying,
decide to
look,
cut taxes for
let's
the wealthiest or upright benefits
create growth
for the poor.
so households can afford their bills, as well as the brilliant work we're doing on energy.
Okay, so he is the chairman of the Conservative Party. I can't find the Private Eye article that details his own history as a so-called serial entrepreneur, which he has in his Twitter biography. And I mean, maybe you think he's right. Maybe you like that idea of telling people who are worried about the cost of living crisis or struggling to make ends meet to go out and get another job. I'm thinking nurses, most obviously. Teachers struggle quite often. Public sector workers are the ones who have arguably made calculations about where they want to be working based upon the public good or the national interest, as opposed to merely what intrigues them the most or what excites them the most, although there's no longer, I don't think, much of a case for arguing that they're going to be better off or worse off than people in the private sector. They're largely interchangeable. But I think of nurses first when I hear Conservative politicians telling people who can't make ends meet to go out and get another job, because what they do is so obviously valuable and important. And this is going to be an hour when we talk about you and we talk about what is going on in your world, because and I know it sometimes isn't easy, and I will do my level best to keep things, if not upbeat, because that isn't quite the appropriate word to describe, but to keep things real. I will do my best to keep it real, always keeping it real on the LBC. 7 minutes after 12 is the time. I just want you to tell Jake Berry what you think about his suggestion, that's all, but with reference to what's currently going on in your life. So I'll play you the clip for the third time, and then I'll play you a little clip of Michael Gove just to cheer you up, all right? So here's Jake Berry again, speaking directly to people who are struggling to make ends meet.
People know that when their bills arrive, they can either cut their consumption or they can get higher salary or higher wages, go out there and get that new job.
Sure, it's
That's the
changes.
approach the government is taking.
You
we
can
are saying,
decide to cut taxes for the wealthiest or upright benefits
create
for the
growth
poor.
so households can afford their bills, as well as the brilliant work we're doing on energy.
I've got the Private Eye newspaper's account of his business career actually in front of me here. I'll run you through some of the highlights. I tell you, I beg your pardon, that's Chris Philp, not Jake Berry. That was close, wasn't it? So Chris Philp, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, is the one you need to check out in Private Eye, not Jake Berry. He's the fellow who thinks that you should just go out and get another job. So I just want to know what you'd say to him, but with reference to your reality, to your lived experience, the idea that he thinks you can go out and get another job if you're struggling to make ends meet. How realistic is that? How much effort have you made to accommodate the cost of living crisis already? Your energy bills are going up, albeit that they've put a cap on units. Kwarteng this morning still apparently failing to understand the difference between a cap on units and a cap on the overall bills. What about soldiers? I mean, they're not particularly well paid. Teachers, what's going to happen to our kids if teachers go out? And what are these jobs? What are these jobs that Jake Berry, chairman of the Conservative Party, suggests that you should be doing? Are you going to come and do this job? This job is very well paid. You're going to come and undercut me? It's probably worth a try, actually. So that's the bit that always confuses me when stories like this unfold. It's like Norman Tebbit saying, get on your bike, which sort of meant that if you were unemployed and there were no jobs in your area, you should get on your bike and go to another area. That, these days, would be almost impossible, actually, with the restrictions and the checks that are in place if you're claiming unemployment benefit. But this isn't even about people claiming unemployment benefit. This is about people who've already got a job, but it's not a good enough job to feed your family, or it's not a good enough job to make ends meet, is the phrase that I like, to make ends meet. You're struggling to make ends meet. And the chairman of the Conservative Party, what didn't he used to head up the Northern Research Group, which was like the gathering of 2019 intake MPs in the so-called red wall seats, the single most uninspiring and unintelligent cohort of parliamentarians that we have ever seen, going right back to Cromwell and beyond, an astonishing Gobi desert of intelligence and talent that came into Parliament off the back of Boris Johnson's ludicrous 2019 election victory, a victory built entirely upon lies and nonsense and effected largely by chucking pretty much everybody in his own party out of the party for the crime of telling the truth about Brexit. But that ship has sailed, and we're now looking at the good ship Jake Berry. And on the good ship Jake Berry, if you're struggling to pay your bills, if you're struggling to make ends meet, if you're struggling to put food on the table, if you are, for example, one of the nearly half of young people worrying that they won't be able to afford food this winter. If you're one of the people that the Prince's Trust has found worrying about not having enough money to buy essentials such as food, toiletries and clothing, Jake Berry's advice is that you go and get a higher paid job. I want you to tell him, with reference to your own life and circumstances, what you think of that advice. Bearing in mind, of course, A, that you're not allowed to swear, and B, I would hope that we could find one or two people who have successfully managed to do this, and possibly others will derive inspiration and information from their example. So you were toiling away as an HGV driver, and you were struggling to make ends meet, and lo and behold, you've now got yourself a job as chairman of the Conservative Party, which has got to be a comfortable six-figure salary, and as far as I can tell, demands very, very little talent or intelligence at all. I mean, it's nice work if you can get it, as they say. The number you need, as ever, 0345 6060 973. And Michael Gove taking a bit of a kicking in the right-wing newspapers early on this morning, as we've established. They completely changed their tune and their front pages. I missed a trick earlier. Should have said it's not just governments that can take U-turns. Newspaper front pages can as well. They can completely change their message within the course of a single morning. I wonder how the Daily Mail will respond when they hear what Michael Gove has been saying about me recently.
I have to say that there are other LBC presenters whom I admire. I mean, I think Andrew Morris is a peerless broadcaster. And James O'Brien, even though he comes from a different part of the political landscape from me, I think is also a superb broadcaster as well. And I think the tone of voice that he has is one that has understandably won him a huge following.
Thank you, Michael. 13 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Should I take bets on how many times I play that out before? No, I don't think so. It's just another person. And in fact, I thought that was quite nice of him. Should I take a call before the break, or should we wait? Should I just give people a few more reasons to ring in after it? I'm really just looking for a straight gut shot response to what Jake Berry has suggested people do if they are struggling to make ends meet. We'll start with Hannah, who's in Southampton. Hannah, what would you like to say to Mr. Berry?
I just can't believe that he is telling people...
You're calling me a liar?
Lower paid... No, not at all. I'm just completely flabbergasted, to be honest, that he is telling these people that they should be going out and finding high-paid jobs because, as you mentioned, a lot of them are nurses, policemen, public sector people that we need to stay in their jobs. We've had, 40,000 nurses leave their posts?
Yeah, there's 100,000 vacancies in social care alone at the moment, and that's people who've already left their jobs to go off and do something better. Because another point he's missed is, and Dan asks this point, who's going to do the jobs they've left when they've left to get the higher paid job?
Well, exactly that. And speaking from my own personal experience, I was in a job and I was like, I need to go and find a better paid job. So I did. I looked around. I found a very well-paid job that I'm in currently. I now don't have to worry about my bills.
Hang on a minute. You're a good example. You're a good example then.
But my point is I'm quite unhappy in my new job, to be honest. I would have rather have stayed in my job where I was a lot happier, and we're being forced out of our jobs where we might be comfortable, more skilled.
What were you doing? Can I ask what you were doing before or not? You don't have to tell me if you don't want to.
No, that's fine. To be honest, I'm in quite a privileged position, to be honest with you. Okay. I work in the IT industry.
Right. He's not really talking about people like you, I don't think, is he?
No, he's not. But my job before was much less well paid than what it is now. But I was like, you know what? I've got to put my big girl pants on. I've got to go and find a better job.
Well, I know you weren't intending this, but you're the caller I was looking for. You're the proof that he's right, but you're here to tell me that he's wrong. I suppose IT is different from being a nurse or being a carer or being a teacher or being a firefighter or I mean, all of the public sector have seen their wages go down, I think, in recent... Or being a railway worker or railway cleaner who wants to go, instead of going on strike, you should go and get a better job.
But my point is that I shouldn't have had to have been forced to look for another job. That's my point.
Yes, you should have been able to live a decent life on the salary that you earned in a full-time job that should have been enough to make ends meet. I do hear you, but I do also have to stress that it might, from one angle, be taken as support for Jake Berry's position. Ashley's in Glasgow. Ashley, what would you like to say? We'll find out after this. 90 minutes after 12 is the time, so there it is. Jake Berry, chairman of the Conservative Party, suggests that if you're struggling to make ends meet, either you haven't done enough yet to cut your cloth or to cut your costs, a bit like our friend in Nottinghamshire who thinks you can feed your family for 30p a meal or 30p a year or 30p a week, I forget which, or it's time to go and get another job. Ashley's in Glasgow. Ashley, what do you make of Mr. Berry's intervention?
Well, I'm one of the nurses you talk about. I'm an acute admissions nurse, so... you're talking really, really, really sick people. Yes. I'm the one that gets them out the ambulances and stabilises them and finds them somewhere to go. On an average shift, I can deal with heart attacks, strokes, elderly people with severe dehydration. Yes. Your real sickies. And I love my job. I am so lucky because I love my job.
Gosh,
I don't think I can afford to keep doing it.
Genuinely, pips are squeaking.
Right, I can't. My day rate is £13 an hour before tax.
Sure.
Take that off, you probably once you've taken off everything else I pay, I've just revalidated, that's £120.
Right.
My union fees, that's £16 a month. After you've taken all of that off, what do I work for? £10 something probably an hour?
It'll be less than that, I think.
Yeah, so I now have to top up with agency shifts, which I don't really enjoy as much, but it pays me nearly triple.
And that's coming. I mean, that's in a private hospital, is it, or is that in an NHS?
No, I go to nursing homes because my previous experience is all in care of the elderly, so I go there. But if you don't mind, James, I'd like to just tell you a story about a shift a few weeks ago.
Absolutely.
So I come in, I get given my six patients. I usually only have 5, but if we're really busy, I'll have 6.
Yeah.
My boss comes up to me and says, we're going to need to shove someone in the corridor. Okay, that's fine. I've got 7. And then I find out that we've converted our staff room, which is where most of our medics go to get their dinner, into a room for a patient. We've shoved a bed in. We've shoved a bed in there. We've shoved a critical care in there, and that's where we're putting people. And I'm walking past, and one of the doctors goes, "Oh, can you help me?" And I'm, yeah, no problem. What is it? He goes, "Where am I meant to look after patients?" And I says, "Well, what do you mean?" He says, "Well, the waiting room's full. Where do I take them?" I said, "Well, we've converted the medics room into like a triage room." He says, "Well, what do you mean?" And I'm like, "Well, you take the patients out of the waiting room, you take them into the triage room, you triage them, you put them back in the waiting room till we can find somewhere to put them." Because what if they're really sick? I said, "Well, how sick are we talking here?"
Yeah.
And he's like, because I was like, everyone's sick. And he's like, "Well, what if they're like really, really, really sick?" And I said, "Then genuinely we will treat them in that room." He says, "Well, what about the next person that's really sick?" And I kind of had to say to him, I said, "I'm really sorry." I said, without sounding really harsh here, I said, it basically gets to the point where we'll do CPR in the corridors if that's what it takes. I said, every single nurse in this unit is completely and utterly dedicated to their life. If we've got to, pardon my crass language, if we've got to jump on a chest in a corridor, that's what we do." And he's like, "But
he couldn't believe it.
How is that possible?" And I'm like, "But that's what we're doing.
This is the normal now. You'll know. Some people listening won't know.
Corridors.
Hospitals are cancelling more than 22,000 appointments a day. So and you still love your job. Briefly, because I've got Paul Johnson from the IFS on the other line, but I don't want to squeeze you unduly. I don't want to jump on your chest, as it were. I want to give you plenty of room to breathe. What is your contracted full-time job as an NHS acute admissions nurse involves what? How many hours a week?
So I only work 2 days a week. I've got 2 very young children.
I see.
So I juggle my time with them because they need mum.
Yeah.
So I will work 2 nights a week. I'll usually shove in an extra kind of back shift where I'll go in and help out the girls, and then I'll do 2 agencies, 5 nights a week. Just to keep my head above water.
Yeah.
And my husband's got a pretty good job, but just to keep us above water where we're not.
I think that's the point, isn't it?
Phoning the gas company every month saying, "I'm sorry, I can't make that bill."
Yeah, I think part of the problem with there's a million problems with what Jake Berry has said, but a large part of it is going to be the idea that people have room to do more, whether it is to work more or to cut more. People haven't already, after 12 years essentially of austerity-driven politics, haven't already done most, if not all, of what they can do. As I mentioned, Paul Johnson of the Institute of Fiscal Studies is on the line, and I don't want to keep him any longer because he's one of the hardest working men in the country at the moment. And I just wanted a little bit more detail, Paul, if you can, on this £2 billion out of a £45 billion tax cut package, and the notion that you expressed earlier today that really drew my eye, that actually in the great scheme of things, what is drawing an awful lot of political heat and attention is, in fiscal terms, close to negligible.
Yeah, I mean, this is clearly backtracking on the 45p cut is a big political change. And indeed, it was a big political signal, I think, when it was cut to 40%, a signal that this was a new government aiming to do things very differently. But in terms of the amounts of money involved, actually, it's a couple of billion a year now, a couple of billions worth having, but It was a £45 billion tax cutting event 10 days ago. So 2 out of 45 is not huge. But I think perhaps people are taking this as a signal that other things may be possible, perhaps other tax rises. Or perhaps even that if you're not giving so much away to the richest, maybe it'll be a bit easier, as you were suggesting, to reintroduce austerity in one way or another. So a big signal here. But in terms of the fiscal numbers, in terms of making the budget books add up, really doesn't make very much difference.
What about in terms of that chill that ran through the markets as well in that case? Because it would seem that there wasn't a great deal there to reassure previously spooked markets that this government are actually fit for purpose.
Yeah, it's strange in a way what happened in the markets because most of what was announced was very well trailed. I mean, we all knew that the corporation tax rise was going to not happen. We all knew that the national insurance rise was going to be undone. It was very clear that the 1p off the basic rate was going to be brought forward. And those were the big bits of the package. And then there were these other parts. And I think what happened with the markets was they were spooked by the idea that there might be more, by the idea that this was a government that was going to do more even than the very big package that was suggested, and by the lack of any indication that there would be any credible package brought forward to put the public finances on a sustainable footing. So it was a strange one in a way, and I almost, but not quite, feel a bit of sympathy for the Chancellor, the Prime Minister, in that they added a couple of relatively small things to the big package they perfectly clearly signalled. And then the market sort of went bananas on them. But the reason, I think, is because they lost credibility by being extraordinarily gung-ho, by having no public finance forecasts. The chance of then going into the TV studio saying, and we're going to do more. I think all of that together was enough, as it were, to be sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. And really, they've kicked off their new government by losing an awful lot of economic credibility.
How hard is it to get back?
It's hard. This is one of these things that you build it up over a very long period of time by having a sensible set of policies and institutions and building trust in the country. And you can see that it gets lost very quickly. It's been lost over different times in places like Greece, Turkey, Italy, various parts of South America, and indeed in parts of Europe at times. If you look at France right at the beginning of the 1980s, or if you look at the UK in the 1970s, you can lose it, and then it can be really very painful to get it back. And I think this is one of the things that we're going to see over the next couple of years, is this government painfully trying to scrabble back towards some kind of credibility, which will hopefully soften the blow in the markets, and in particular, what the Bank of England might do.
And you mentioned the absence of forecasts with last week's mini-budget. I suppose there's been a U-turn on that as well, with the OBR being invited into Downing Street late last week, albeit briefly, and the current insistence that whatever the OBR advised the Chancellor won't be going public with that advice until towards the end of November. That's suboptimal, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, that's kind of standard. I mean, the OBR will provide forecasts a couple of months, 6 to 8 weeks before any fiscal event, and those are kept private, and they're worked up between the OBR and the Treasury as the Treasury changes its policies and so on. But this is that's how it normally works for a budget. But this is slightly different, isn't it? Because we've had the budget effectively, even if it wasn't called a budget. And at least as far as we're being told, all that we're going to hear on the 23rd of November is the OBR forecasts and the Chancellor's statement about what his new fiscal rules or targets are going to be. Now, one thing that I think the key reason that we're not going to get the OBR forecasts until then is that I think the Chancellor's going to want to be working out what his fiscal target is going to be off the back of what the forecasts are going to be, so that the two are consistent. So I'm not so surprised that that's where we've ended up. I think that once you've not done them at the point of the budget, which is what we've lost now,
you can't sort of do them.
We're not waiting too long now.
No, I understand. Paul, I know how busy you are, so I thank you for your time, and we brought you in just before 12:30 as promised.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul Johnson from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which sort of stepped into the breach a little bit last week, providing some of the analysis that you would have perhaps expected from the Office of Budgetary Responsibility, albeit that one comes after the event and the other one comes before. 12:30 is the time. Tim Humphrey is here now with your headlines. 33 minutes after 12, for those of us who inhabit reality and want the best for our country, despite the attempts at self-sabotage, some very, very successful of the last few years, I think this counts as good news. European Commission has confirmed this morning that technical talks between EU and UK officials will take place this week on the Northern Ireland Protocol. I wonder whether that's lost some of its rhetorical bite for Liz Truss, and that they will actually come to some sort of arrangement. The European Commission have been open to forms of recalibration from pretty much the get-go, but that idea of the political promise that there'll be no checks, or indeed the willingness to leave the DUP dangling in the wind, which is going to be a crucial part of protecting the Good Friday Agreement, I wonder now whether or not that just gets filed under. Can we make that one go away? Can we do what needs to be done to get Stormont reopened, or to get the protocol essentially removed from the to-do list? We shall see. I might talk to Tony Connolly about that tomorrow, one of our, arguably the doyen of chroniclers of that particular corner of the Brexit brouhaha. 12:34 is the time. Back to Jake Berry's advice that if you're struggling to make ends meet, just get a better job. Get a bigger job. Tim's in Melbourne. Tim, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. So I spoke to you quite a lot during COVID. I'm an ICU nurse.
Yes. You were in Leeds.
I was in Leeds, yeah.
Where are you in Melbourne, Lincolnshire, or Melbourne, Australia?
It's Melbourne, Australia.
Oh,
yeah. It's
what happened?
Far better weather. Well, I moved out here a year ago just for an opportunity, initially just to do 6 months, just for some life experience, really. And in the UK, I was a charge nurse on intensive care, so there'd be days that I would be in charge of the entire ICU. I was on £16.50 an hour for the responsibility of the whole ICU, basically. And I've come out to Australia, and I'm doing work at one of the big hospitals in Melbourne. And I have less responsibility. I'm not in charge of the whole show. I've just had the one patient, and I'm on double what I was on as a charge nurse in the UK. I'm having to think very carefully about what my next move is. I've already extended my visa, so it's looking more like a 2-year job rather than a 6-month one.
Will you be? You can stay in that kind of role. You can stay for as long as you want, can you? Probably.
It's super easy. It's really, really easy. Dead simple, because they're crying out for nurses here as well as they are everywhere. Although the cry seems a bit quieter in the UK than it does here, and yet the conditions and the ratios are much better here.
I think the vacancy rate is much higher here, isn't it? So in many ways the cry should be louder.
Absolutely. But I think with the current economic circumstances, with the fact that it's incredibly unlikely that we'll get a pay rise in line with inflation, I'm nearly 30, I'm wanting to look at buying a house, and I was living pretty paycheck to paycheck before I came to Australia, and the disposable income you have here is much better. And the thought of going back to worse circumstances, it makes me quite depressed. I would really love to be back in the UK. All my family's there, but the thought of actually going back is actually quite excruciating.
You also
I really don't know if I can do it.
You probably have. I don't want to make light of a very serious condition, but you probably have a sort of post-COVID thing going on as well, given that your working life when you were last here was so hellish in so many ways. This is what we used to talk about, isn't it? That you probably can't separate the memory from the present. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah, and I think the funny thing about COVID, my experience of it was that it was obviously very hellish, and I felt that when we came out of COVID, the circumstances didn't really change. The ratios and the workload didn't change. Yes. It was 10 times worse than what it was before COVID. And now I just think it's going to get worse. With the rate that people are leaving the NHS, and in terms of what Jake Berry said and cost of living, I think all that comment will do to people like nurses. It will drive them out the country. They will literally say, get stuffed, please. We're off. Because I know a lot of my friends are doing it. We've taken 3 nurses in the last fortnight from the UK over to Australia.
Really?
This is going to keep happening. Yeah, this is going to, and that's just one hospital and one department. And this is going to keep happening. And the more that we get hammered into the ground in the UK, the more the cost of living goes up, the more unaffordable it is to live in the UK. People aren't going to go back. I have full intention on going back. I don't know now.
Oh, I can tell. I can tell. Have you got a nice life out there? Have you made friends? Have you settled in?
I've got loads of friends. Ironically, most of them are English doctors and nurses who all have a similar mindset.
I've got a mate in Melbourne who's a doctor. Actually, you've just reminded me. It is a nice old life out there, isn't there? Yeah.
It's wonderful. I mean, Melbourne's an amazing place. I don't want to attract too many nurses over here, obviously, because you guys need them.
Yes, I know. That says it all, really. So Norman Tebbit said, "Get on your bike." Jake Berry has accidentally said to nurses across the country, "Get on a plane. Get on the next plane to Australia."
I was talking to a friend the day after. We're all quite politically engaged over here, and I was talking to a friend the day after Kwarteng's budget announcement, and him and his partner, they both had full intention on going back to the UK.
Right.
One's a doctor, one's not, and they've said they're not going to do it now.
Good Lord. In a direct response to the budget announcement?
Yeah. Just because they're quite financially savvy people. One of them's got a financial
background. He's taking away the increase in national insurance, which would have been something of a light at the end of the tunnel for people in the NHS, whether it was ring fence for social care or whether it was going to make its way through the NHS in the traditional fashion. The government has signalled its belief that the NHS doesn't need any more support.
It would have been about something like £15 a month for me. So, a huge difference. And the other thing that I wanted to just say lastly is that Australia's always had a reputation of the cost of living here being higher than the UK.
That's right, yes.
I completely think it's flipped. Completely.
Well, we'd need to see the numbers, wouldn't we? But it makes sense. It makes sense.
For me, certainly, my energy bill here is about £20 a month.
No, fair enough. I mean, there's a lot of coal, isn't there, in Australia, I think, still. So there's all sorts of different variables.
I think it's pretty self-sufficient.
There's all different variables going on. But at the end of the day, you're just looking at what it says on your bill in Melbourne and what it would say on your bill back in Leeds. Tim, it's good to talk to you, mate. I didn't realise, obviously, that you'd hit the road. You haven't even sent me a postcard, but at least now we've made contact with each other. And there is someone who was, a very valuable contributor during coronavirus, during lockdowns, and the whole saga, actually, working, as he told you, in ICU, essentially following Jake Berry's advice and getting a better job in Melbourne as opposed to Leeds. 12:40 is the time. Speaking of Leeds, I don't know if it was Leeds, but speaking of the regions outside London, one of the amusing upshots about this ludicrous U-turn, or rather this U-turn on this ludicrous policy, is that Liz Truss had already done a round. Do you remember how badly it went for her on the radio when she spoke to regional BBC stations last week and absolutely fell to pieces? Well, she'd already recorded a round of interviews for regional ITV stations over the weekend, which were due to be released from embargo today. So they were recorded either yesterday or on Saturday. Or even last week, actually, I'm not sure, on the proviso that the embargo would be lifted when conference started this morning. You guess what happens next, can't you? So what that means is that as of this morning, a whole round of ITV interviews have been, cleared for release. This is one that she gave to Emma Hutchinson, who's the political correspondent for Anglia News and the presenter of Anglia Late Edition. See if you can spot what's gone wrong with this this cunning plan of Downing Street's.
So you won't change your mind on the 45p rate? No.
Short and sweet. 12:42 is the time. Lily's in Huddersfield. Lily, what would you like to say?
I'd just like to say how angry I am. I've worked in nurseries in early years for all my career, and I now have my own business doing baby massage and things like that. And it's so infuriating that our society isn't putting focus on that. If we put focus on early years, we would grow richer as a society because we would have more confident children. That meant more confident, more well-equipped adults to go out into the world. And it's just so frustrating. It's just, I cannot even tell you how angry I am that someone is just telling me to go and get a better job, just, instead of doing the work I do.
That is how you feel? You take it personally. So presumably you are looking at the numbers at the moment and wondering quite how you're going to stay afloat.
Absolutely. But then I'm sure all of these Tory MPs have their children in childcare, have a nanny. Who's going to do that job so they can go out and make these ridiculous statements?
Jacob Rees-Mogg is my age. He's still got a nanny. I'm not even joking.
It's infuriating.
It's more than that. I mean, it is. Yes, it does speak of an attitude. It's not society's attitude. It's this particular brand of politicians' attitude. It's their belief is that you don't need to look after. In a way, what you're saying is the human equivalent of if you look after the pennies, the pounds will look after themselves, isn't it? The more care you put into the little people, then when we all grow up, the more rounded and productive, if you want to use that word, we would be. And yet they seem to think it's a waste of time.
It's not worth doing that job. I should go out and get a different job, a more well-paid job.
That is the message that they're sending to you, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just it's so infuriating, and it's so disrespectful. And on the radio, there's everybody talking about nurses, and my sister's a nurse, and I really respect nurses. But everyone always forgets about these men, women that work these long hours in nurseries and put the care into other people's children and educate them so they can go off and do the job, the higher paid jobs. The jobs that also make society.
I will endeavour to remember. I mean, you understand why nurses and teachers will draw more attention, but you're absolutely right to remind us.
That's the sector. That's what's like working in the sector anyway. All through COVID, when it was like, will teachers be okay being back in the classroom? Yeah. Well, we were all there anyway, with different households looking after key worker children anyway. But we didn't get a mention. But that's not my point. That's another day.
I hear you. Thank you, Lily. Thank you on every level. And it's not just you as well at doing childcare. It's social care as well, which we're trying to pay a little bit more attention to than we have done previously. And that, of course, suffers, from the National Insurance announcement, which, as Tim in Melbourne reminded us, it might put 15 quid a month in our pockets, but it comes out of a pot that was intended for imminent delivery to either social care or the NHS or both. It's 12:45. It is 12:48. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we just examine how just a canvassing response to the chairman of the Conservative Party's suggestion that if after 12 years of Tory rule you are struggling to make ends meet, then you either need to make more savings across your expenditure or you need to get a better paid job. I'll say that again. After 12 years of Tory rule, if you're struggling to make ends meet, the chairman of the Tory party thinks you need to get a better paid job. And we have spoken largely to people in the caring professions, nurses and childcare, about what that means and how they feel about that. I would say rather insulting suggestion. James is in Liverpool. James, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for taking my call.
You're very welcome.
I couldn't believe it, to be honest. I remember a few months ago, another Tory politician had said something similar about people just getting, higher paid jobs, and that was met with widespread condemnation, and rightly so. But they've clearly not learned their lesson, because this guy's just said the same thing. And I just couldn't believe it, because I'm a junior doctor,
right,
and pretty much the same as your previous caller, Tim, I think his name was.
Yeah.
I'm now pretty much living paycheck to paycheck, constantly in my overdraft, because I've noticed in the last 6 months my wages just aren't stretching as much as they did previously, with fuel, cost of food, cost of energy. And basically what he's saying is that I should basically write off 6 years of medical school, 5 years postgraduate and specialist training in order to presumably wheedle my way into some champagne reception where I can bet against the British economy.
I guess, I'm not here to defend him, obviously. I guess he would not realise, as opposed to not care, that junior doctors would fit into the category that he's describing. In his mind, he's probably got an image of people lower down what he would see as a ladder of importance or a ladder of status.
Yeah, and that's partly the reason why I called, because I think there's a narrative amongst a lot of people in this country that, you know, doctors are minted and we earn loads of money, and it's just not the case, particularly for junior doctors who are in training. Much like myself, it's not a well-paid job if you're training. It's moderately well-paid. We do okay, but like I said, with everything that's going on, that's becoming less and less. And echoing what your previous caller said again, lots of my colleagues are just not standing for it, and they're all going to Australia.
And that, I mean, I first encountered this 20 years ago, but that was a lifestyle choice about the attractions of Australia rather than a almost reluctant. I thought what was fascinating about Tim's call was the quandary in which he finds himself and the pain he's clearly feeling about the prospect of not coming back. It's not what happened to my mate. God, I'm so old, mate. It would be about 20 years ago when a pal of mine went to Melbourne because they really fancied living in Australia, and it had nothing to do with, if you like, fleeing the UK or turning your back on the UK. They just really fancied living in Australia. It's a very different picture now. This is about reaching a point where it's almost become unbearable here, and therefore having a look around at where else you might be able to ply your professional trade.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, probably 70 to 80% of colleagues who are going out there now is less about the lifestyle and just more about not working in the NHS anymore.
Because if you've done that training, if you've done those years, it's almost impossible to contemplate doing something else. However, far from your expectations, the reality, so if you go back to when you started at medical school and what you were expecting to be working in now is very different from what you are actually working in. You've still, as you've reminded us, you've got all those years on the clock, and you've got a form of vocation, I presume, James, like most medical people. You're doing something because you want to make a difference, because you want to care, and
absolutely. Nobody gets into this line of work because they want to make, you know, loads of money. It's just, you know, people do it because they enjoy it. It's an interesting job. There's a lot of variety. It's an amazing job. But
we need people like you, and you're not feeling cherished at all. And if you've got a mortgage, it could go up by 4 times next year.
This is the other worry, because I've got a fixed rate mortgage, thankfully, so I'm kind of insulated for the next couple of years. But I've got friends who aren't in that position.
What are they going to do? What are they going to do?
They don't. That's what they're saying to themselves, because the government haven't said anything, because you're going to have swathes of people who were seemingly comfortable, well-off middle earners who are now facing the very real risk of losing their houses. It's mental.
You know, isn't it funny? Because this is obviously the big story moving forward. And I appreciate not everybody listening has got a mortgage or is going to get caught in the eye of the storm. And I don't expect anyone to get their violins out for the city trader we were talking to earlier who has got, you know, we're talking about £500,000 salaries, but there'll be people there who won't be able to pay the mortgages that they have currently got because they got them based on what was likely to happen to interest rates. And then we come down to doctors and your colleagues and your peers who won't be able to pay the mortgages that they've got. And then you go down further to nurses. Donna's been in touch. She said, I've just texted the Spice Girls, James, to see if I can go on tour with them, as my NHS job means I can't currently meet my bills. I mean, that's the big story. And Rishi Sunak explained that if you try and borrow your way out of inflation, then interest rates will go up, and it's almost as if they've just stuck their fingers in their ears.
I mean, he's got to be feeling so smug right now. Just when you think of what was said at those hustings, yeah. I mean, word for word, he's predicted what has happened.
He said something like, I'm not going to go to conference because I really feel that Liz Truss should be free to completely own the moment. Yes, of course, and I don't want to say this particularly, but I think I have to. It may be deliberate, you know. David Davis writing an article for The Telegraph today, I think, or yesterday, in which he's talking about how an insurance-only model insurance model is the only way forward for the NHS. Those of us who've been saying for a very, very long time that They'll come for the NHS soon, next, eventually. Again, not going to feel any smug sense of satisfaction about almost certainly being proved right any more than we are about Brexit. But at some point, people are going to reach a breaking point. Where that point is, we do not know. There are individual breaking points. Tim's reached his, James is approaching his, Donna's reached hers, unless, of course, the Spice Girls get back in touch, in which case she gets a reprieve. The country as a whole, the electorate, the population, I don't know. 12:55 is the time. Clive's in Luton. Clive, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello.
Thanks for the show. Great show as always. I feel like I'm at confession, if I can. Forgive me, Father, I've sinned. I got brought up in a conservative household. Nan, granddad, conservatives, mum, dad, etc. As I've grown up, I'm 33 now. I'm embarrassed to have voted Conservative in the last general election, and I'm so glad that my eyes have now been opened, but I just feel so embarrassed. So I'm fortunate. I'm in a really great job, and I'm very much looked after by my employer. But I work very closely with the NHS, and I've called you before and discussed this.
Yes.
So in the last
you recruit healthcare workers for the NHS.
That's the one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I thought so.
This year we've. I was listening to the news at the start of the year and seeing all of the vaccination centres that have been bought and paid for by the Department of Health and Social Care. And I thought to myself, well, why don't we fill them with people so that we can hire hundreds of people in a day for the NHS? Anyway, the NHS went for it. They're very open to innovative ways to recruit people. Yeah, and we've made over 4,000 offers from 8 large events. So we took over Old Trafford Cricket Ground, we took over Lord's Cricket Ground and others. But, James, there's nothing quite like being on the ground for a day. Number one, seeing the NHS workers that are already in positions, but also, secondly, the people that are applying for these jobs and how desperate they are for work, but also to work for the NHS. And the fact that this guy, I can't even remember his name, but he's not even worth saying in my eyes.
Oh, it is. Jake Berry. He's got constituents. Jake Berry.
The fact that he's saying these people can go and get more paid jobs it's ridiculous.
Do you know what he's doing, Clive? Robin's pointed out he's turning British healthcare professionals into economic migrants. So they're going in the wrong direction. Makes your job harder.
Yeah, it does. And we've partnered for these events, James, with the Department of Work and Pensions, who are doing amazing work at the moment.
It's good to hear.
Getting people long-term unemployed into work. And we had a client at the London hiring event who had been unemployed for a period of time, was actually made homeless by his parents for, personal reasons, which I won't go into. The DWP paid for him to go and get an outfit. We prepared him for the interview, and he's now working in the NHS. So what's Jake going to say to him? You should go and get a more expensive role.
It's good to hear that. No, I know. I mean, it's good to hear that they're doing that. But the idea that if he's struggling to pay his bills, he's going to have to go off and find a better. We need to hear more stories like this about good stuff going on. Not always political, often just civil service initiatives, but some credit where credit is due. That sounds like a great scheme unfolding over there. You've taken us up to the wire, Clive. My apologies to Tricia in Bournemouth and to Kay in Hastings and Tamara and Alistair and others. But I guess what, I'll be back tomorrow. And I wanted to finish, because we mentioned him a few times on the show today, 30p Lee. You remember the lad in Nottinghamshire who thinks you can feed your family for 30p a meal. He's had something to say today about the thing that every single person on the planet is describing as a U-turn. Here's Lee Anderson.
What do you think about the Chancellor's U-turn on the 45p tax rate?
It's not a U-turn, Alison, it's a change of direction.
Oh, bless his little cotton socks. Here's Sheila Fogarty. 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 Here's Sheila Fogarty.